You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Greetings, folks. Happy Monday evening. Hope you had a great weekend. We had a good weekend over here. I did very little this weekend, to be honest, that was productive or worthwhile or meant for the books. I just kind of sat around and binge-watched old episodes of the original Perry Mason from the late 1950s. I think 1959 was the first year of the season for that. This is Scotty Roberts, by the way, and you're listening to my program, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. And you can go over there and find out all the goodness that's Odyssey Radio and all the different outlets where you can find this show playing in its audio format. And you can come on over to, if you're not already there, my YouTube channel to see the video simulcast of this show. And that's over at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. And you can join the live chat room going on there right now. And I want to thank you all for being here, all those of you who were here yesterday, Sunday morning, for It's Sunday. I know, not the most auspicious name in the world for a Sunday morning talk show, but it was fun. It's always fun to get together, be off network, so to speak, and to go live with everybody and have a very casual time on Sunday mornings, do some tarot readings and things like that. So we had a lot of fun yesterday morning. And my wife usually comes in, Rainey Roberts, and so if you'd like to get a little taste of what she is like, what she's all about, the spirited, exuberant, vivacious, young, luscious bride of mine that been married almost 14 years now, together for close to 16 years, and we've got 3 kids. Come on over on Sunday mornings. You get a little taste of what she's all about. And some people say she keeps me young. Other people say that's why I'm losing my hair. And other people say she's a good mom. Well, I say she's a good wife and she's a good everything. So I have a good time when she comes on the show. You might enjoy that on Sunday mornings. And we're looking to see if we can get her on a very regular basis. She's been on the last few Sundays with me, off and on, and she's got a lot to contribute. So we had a good time. Before we get rolling into today's show, and I do want to talk about Joseph and probably wrap up this whole thing on Joseph, and before we start into something new and different, you'd think Monday would be a great day to start a new series, and Fridays would be the great days to end series. But I had more I wanted to say last Friday at the end of the show. I'm going to recap a little bit, of course, as we get into it, talking about Joseph and the historical Joseph. And before we get into that, though, before we even get into the topic, I want to mention one thing. The left has been pushing for Trump's tax returns for how long? And I've said all along, I don't really care. I don't care what his tax returns are. And the same thing with Obama or anybody else. I don't really care. I don't care what their tax returns have to say. If I wanted to run for office, you want to look at my tax returns, fine. But it's not a requirement. So if you're going to make it a requirement, I just might buck you on it. And I've heard all about this story about his tax returns. Haven't researched it and studied it out. All I've heard is that Trump's response basically was, they don't have a handle on the facts on this, so they can go really take a long hike off a short pier. And so there's no requirement in the Constitution that a man shows his taxes, or a person, whoever. So far it's only been men, presidents, so I'll use that. A president, doesn't have to show his taxes. A woman, if she ever becomes president, doesn't have to show her taxes. I don't really care. And I don't really care what Trump did as a businessman. I had somebody criticize him, and I responded to them this morning, and I said, let me ask you this question. If you had 500 plus companies, his companies paid tens of millions of dollars in tax. I said, and that comes out of his pocket. He owns those companies. I said, how many of you own 500 plus companies, and how many of you work to bury as much income as you can on your taxes? I said, this guy, no differently. And you know what? I'd rather see a billionaire become a public servant and look at his taxes than see a public servant who's made millions off of being a public servant. I'd rather look at their tax returns. We'll leave it at that. I got no big problem with it either way. And it's not it's not anything I didn't expect. And I'm pretty sure I'm not getting the whole story anyway. Oh, and I will say this. For the New York Times to release this information now, and the tack and the angle they're taking on it, this is not journalism. This is propaganda to push the nation against voting for the sitting president. And if this is not transparent enough about the New York Times now, I don't care what the story. If the story was something they thought was going to help Trump, I bet you they wouldn't have run it. This is something that they think might hurt him. I don't think so. Frankly, I don't think people care as much as those really pushing the issue care. So we'll leave it at that. And now let's move on. We're talking about Joseph, and I'm talking about the history of Joseph. And there's something I want to make very clear. I went to a lot of effort earlier in the year and a little bit last year to talk about Orthodox Christianity, the literalist Orthodox Christianity. And we talked a lot about Christ and the story of Christianity in its early days and how the literalist church won over. And I have, how would I want to say this, is that I maintain those same views about the Bible, about theology, about literalist biblical theology. However, I have said through the whole thing that I have always supported the historicity of the Bible, that the Bible has accurate history, that the Bible presents a historical picture that is accurate. The historical events mentioned in the Bible are accurate, they're efficacious. They've been verified over and over and over again, especially over the last century and a half of biblical archaeology surrounding biblical topics. And I think people have gone out of their way to conduct biblical archaeology because of the importance of Judaism and Christianity to the world. And so when they look at these events, they find they aren't fables, they aren't imaginary tales, although some of them, tales like we've talked about with Joseph, maybe there was an element of that. Maybe with David, the king of Israel, there was an element of apologetic to set up this person as being something he's really not. But what those stories do in presenting an apologetic and accepting that there was an apologetic put in place, or perhaps a grossly exaggerated story, it doesn't take away from the fact that that historical character existed and that he did what those biblical events said he did. As far as being in history, you can question whether or not he's the guy that really slew Goliath. You can question whether or not he was actually having an affair with the king's wife, and that's why the king wanted to kill him, not because he was a godly man of some sort. And so you can look at those things. Those don't question whether he existed. They just question the details of his story. And the same thing with Moses, the same thing with Joseph, the same thing with Jesus. And these characters, there's no reason really to doubt that these weren't real people. It's what we've done with their stories is the question. And you can see throughout the story of Joseph, as we've talked about it, that there are lots of things that could be attributed to stories that smack of characteristics of telling a cautionary tale or a tale that supports the history of Israel or supports the God of Israel. It supports putting forward the theology, a morality tale, if you will, as well. Yet, finding out facts that Joseph most probably existed and looking at the history, to me, this cracks it open. It is no longer just a story about a Jacob, Israel, who had 12 sons, and the 11 older sons were jealous and sold the younger son into slavery, and that son later was risen to great power in the country where he ended up as a slave, as in Egypt. And he becomes the Grand Vizier of that country because he's able to interpret dreams. And that the Pharaoh sitting on the throne whose dreams he interpreted most probably was what you might say, a shoestring relative, a long-distance relative. They're both from the Canaanite heritage, from the Hyksos, the Asiatic peoples coming into Egypt. And so you can look at that tale, and then his brothers coming 20 years later and needing refuge in that country from the famine. And Joseph recognizing them, but them not recognizing him. And then the details he puts them through for the sake of moving the story along. And then finally the reveal to his brothers of who he is. And he gives them the best land, and they come down. And this starts their sojourn in Egypt. And it was from this time in Egypt that the Bible says that the Hebrews, the Israelites, dwelt there for 400 years. Some say that's really interpreted as a 230-year period, and we'll get into that a little bit today and talk about that and how that fits into this time period and how the history works. And then that leads up, of course, to bondage and slavery and eventually the Exodus. So all of these things, while you can look at the theology behind it and say, is that literal theology? Does this prove the existence of God? Or are religious people, spiritual people, taking those stories and applying their own religious story and theologies to them? That's the big question. I'm not denying that. I'm not saying it's so. But if you've been indoctrinated, if you will, or inculcated into a certain religion, you're going to believe the literalist interpretation of the Bible. But that literalist interpretation, you can have a different outlook on that. You can have a different view. You can say, look, I can understand that the history is real, but I may want to interpret the theology different, or what we've been taught is so about those passages. So I believe Joseph was a real guy. And something we left off on, and that's not to diminish who he is by calling him a real guy. Joseph was a real person in history, just like I believe Moses was a real person in history. These pharaohs were real people in history. Pharaoh's daughter in the story of Moses, Hatshepsut, was a real person. Senenmut, the guy sitting over my shoulder here, that bust back there, was a real person. These are all real people. And they were written about in texts, and they're only made to seem fantastical because we've elevated some of these characters to Christian or Jewish storybook characters. We've storybookized them, I've said in the past, and many times over. And so just because we've talked about them, made them legends and almost mythology, and it is part of the Christian and the Jewish mythology, but because we've made them so, we tend to lose connectivity with the fact that these were real people in history. Abraham Lincoln was a real guy. Maybe 1,000 years from now, they'll think, did Abraham Lincoln ever really exist? George Washington was a real guy. But the big question, it's things like, did he actually chop down the cherry tree? Father, I did not chop down that cherry tree. I cannot tell a lie. Is that a real event that happened to him, or is it a myth? Is it a legend that's grown up around the real man? So even in our own history, we see people who are real people that have turned into legend over the years, and eventually that will be mythology, the American mythology. And so maybe we have a little bit of that going on now with all the politics that go on in this country, all the divisiveness that is started by certain movements of people to try to say we are not as good as we are not what we are supposed to be. And they want to rewrite our history. They want to make into a myth anything that was good about us. Maybe that's what we're seeing with some biblical history. So, bringing it back down, Joseph was a real guy. And there have been discoveries that have been made, and we hit on this a little bit both last week and even before that. And I want to show you a couple things again. Those of you who weren't here and didn't get to see this, now you get a chance. Those of you watching the video simulcast on YouTube, you're going to get an advantage over the people just listening, because I'm going to show you some imagery. And some of this you've already seen, but we're going to go ahead and just do a little quick recap on some of the imagery. And I want you to see, here's a map, and I put this map together. And this is northern Egypt. You can see Cairo is at the mouth of the delta. The Nile fan that delta going up to the Mediterranean. Memphis or Mennefer down just slightly, about 30 miles south of Cairo. Up to the northeast there you see Avaris, known as Pi-Ramses or Pithom and Ramses. The way to think of this city is that Ramesses built this city, but not originally. He rebuilt the city. And what is found is the city of Ramses, Pi-Ramses, is on one archaeological level. The city of Avaris is beneath it. They have to dig deeper into the ground and find Avaris beneath it. And you can see how close Avaris is to the Wadi Tumilat. That's about 30 to 35 miles in there. Something like that. Especially when you look at this map. And you can see way up in the upper left-hand corner, you see where I've got Avaris and the white arrow pointing to that little brown kind of dot there. That's the area of the city of Avaris and Tel El Daba, and where they found the palace and things like that of Joseph. Now you look at that, and you just go down south to the Wadi Tumilat there, that arc going from the left side of the picture all the way over to just past center right. That arc is a very fertile piece. You can see by the greenery in there. That's a wadi. Water rushes through there maybe once a year. It's a wadi. It was also part of the trade route. It connected with the trade route. And it came down to the northern tip of the Sea of Reeds, which is the marshy lakes to the north of the tip of the Red Sea. So that's only about 30 miles from Avaris there to the Wadi Tumilat. So when all the Hebrews came out of Goshen, which is that whole region right there, and way off to the left, the north and the left here, they all came down and they exited, crossing through the Wadi Tumilat and down to the Sea of Reeds. And somewhere in here was where they ended up, and the waters were parted, and they went across on dry ground, it says, and they go down the eastern side of the Sea of the Red Sea. And so, looking at these pictures, I want you to see this picture. Let's see, here's a map. Now, zooming way in on that little brown dot, there is Avaris there. That is, and it's no longer called that, but right in the middle you see Tel El Daba. And that is the archaeological ground. That's where all that work is going on. And of course there we saw, they found the ruins of this palace. Up on the upper side of this picture, just to the right of center, that palace. And that palace, as they looked into it a bit more, in the ruins they found it had the 12 pillars here, which described Joseph's palace, the 12 pillars for his 12 brothers. They also had, and here's another view of that. And they had all these up into the top of this picture. You see the palace and you see the 12 tombs out there. Now this is a digital reconstruction, obviously, but this is the tombs as you see them that were laid out. There were 12 tombs there for Joseph and his brothers. And the tomb that's the pyramid, which is this one right here, see to the left of the picture, that is a tomb. They were only built those kinds of tombs for royals, for people who were considered royal or part of the royal family, or had royal distinction to them. And so this is the city of Avaris. I've got a couple of other digital recreations. I want to show you this. Now this is Pi-Ramses. Look at this. This is an amazing digital reconstruction of this city. And this would have been Pi-Ramses built on top of Avaris. And it was the most populated city in the world of its time. And this is the city that Ramesses would have reconstructed on the top of Avaris, expanded it, made it his treasure city. And so I think that's a pretty cool reconstruction of this is built digitally. And of course there's a lot of surmising in this, but this is built off of what they found of the ruins there at Avaris. And so this is what and this is would have been Avaris here, with the palace in the background you see. This would have been the earlier city that was built there. This would have been the city of Joseph. and the city where he built his palace, and where the Israelites would have dwelt. And they found Semitic homes, Semitic graves, Semitic artifacts spread all through this from people who would have been Canaanite in heritage in this great Egyptian city. All right, so we're establishing the city existed, the palace exists, the tombs exist. And there's a picture I'll show you when we come back, because I haven't loaded it yet, and I don't want to take the time to do it live here. But during the break, I'll grab this picture and put it in here that shows how this statue would have looked. And this is where we left off on Friday, was this, the statue of Joseph. Now, it's not labeled Joseph. We don't know for 100% certain that this is the Joseph of the Bible. So what you have to do, as you do in archaeology and reconstructing history, it's like forensics. You have to go in and look at all the artifacts and all the details, all the stories, all the history. And this statue is definitely one thing they know for sure. Even those who want to deny that the story of Joseph was a real story about a real person, the thing they cannot deny is the fact, and they shouldn't deny it at all, and that this is the statue of a Semitic man, a Canaanite man, who is wearing what was called the mushroom headdress. Has been dubbed that. That's not what they called it back then, but the red wig that he's wearing. He also had the, or it could have been his own hairstyle. He's got red hair. He's got the yellow skin of the Canaanites. He's also wearing a robe that is not the coat of many colors, but it is the robe that is very similar to, if you remember these pictures that we had of the Asiatics and what they would have looked like. Now look at his robe here on this statue, then look at this. And then you look at the clothing that they were wearing on the wall paintings from a time before the time of Joseph, the Asiatics coming in to Egypt. So perhaps this is what was meant by the coat of many colors. It was the patterned fabrics that were built into a coat of honor for Joseph. And so you've got a lot of these little bits and pieces that add up, that many scholars are now saying, if Joseph existed, this may very well have been him. And so when we come back, we're going to dig into this just a little deeper now. I'm going to get into some things Shimki Yakubovici had to say about this, and what some scholars have had to say about this statue. And I think we're going to leave this show tonight with a pretty good idea of who Joseph was, that he was real in history, and that this is indeed his statue that they found over in Pi Ramses, which was once Avaris, the Israelite settlement city in Egypt. So you guys sit tight. We'll be right back after this break.
looking for a really awesome and amazing graphic designer? How about an illustrator or a photographer? This is Rainey Roberts, and I wanted to tell you how you can get my designer, illustrator husband, Scotty Roberts, to work for you on your project. Do you have an awesome self-published book but no cover, or even worse, a cover that really sucks? Do you need a kick-ass logo for your company or some f***ing awesome graphic designs for your ads or website? Then get in touch with my husband for the best f***ing awesome kick-ass design and illustration. He knows his stuff, and he's been at this for more years than I've been alive. Go to ScottAllenRoberts.com. That's Scott with 2 T's, ALANROBERTS.com to take a look at his online portfolio of work, or call 651-468-8115. Now go out and kick some ass with some kick-ass graphic design.
Hire my dad so he can take me to Disneyland.
All right, folks, thanks for waiting on through that break. This is Scotty Roberts. Welcome back to the show. You're listening to my program, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. Come on over and see the video simulcast of this show and join the live chat room of fellow Intrepids that's going on right now over at my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Now, we are talking about Joseph. And first thing you got to kind of sit back and say, is it important for me to know anything about Joseph? Why is it important that I know whether or not, or understand whether or not he was a real guy? Now, that's really a choice that's up to you, whether that's an important thing for you to know or not. But I know many of us grew up in the Christian Judeo-Christian faith. And many of us, even if we've left that faith, it's always nice to know that some of the things that you were taught maybe had real people involved behind them. This is what's fascinating to me about this story. It would be like taking Homer's Odyssey, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and taking the character of Ulysses, Odysseus, who basically the radio station is kind of named after him, the Odyssey. Odysseus was the king, better known as Ulysses, and he took this fantastic voyage. I've known that there have been archaeologists and historians that have traced the footsteps and the sailing and the mission and the map that is made up in Iliad and the Odyssey to see if any of these places really existed. And they have found that it's very interesting that many of these named places existed. The route existed, and so on. And to me, that's fascinating history. It's like the Trojan Wars and learning about the Trojan horse. These are all part of Homer's writings. And are we to take those as historical writings, or they're pure mythology? And when you find that there's a lot of information, when they discovered the city of Troy, Schliemann was his name, back in the 1800s. He was really a fortune hunter, but he discovered the city of Troy. And there's been a lot of excavation work there, and there's been a lot that we've learned about the Trojan War since then. Now, isn't it fascinating to find out that this mythology had an actual story at its core, or something I want to get into as a series and talk about? One of my favorites, Robin Hood. We've all heard Robin Hood stories as legends since we were children. But was there a real Robin Hood? That's a big question. And there's scholars still digging into it, and there's some scholars believe they found the answers to that. Jack the Ripper, King Arthur, all these characters we have in history that have been elevated to legendary status or mythological status in our minds. It's fantastic to learn that there's real history behind them. And this is why I think we look at the biblical story, because there's such importance to the biblical story for so many people, whether we are practicing a faith or not. And so the big question, is there archaeological evidence for the biblical Joseph? That's the question that's on the table. If you misdate the biblical Exodus, in other words, if you put the biblical Exodus under Moses, which we covered a couple of weeks ago, into a historical context where it doesn't belong, then by definition you won't find any archaeological evidence for Joseph, because he's the one that got them all there in the first place, into Egypt. or any other biblical figure for that matter. And this is precisely what the majority of archaeologists do when they date the Exodus. First, they say it didn't happen, never happened. Then they illogically date what didn't happen to the 13th century BCE, around 1270 BCE, to be precise, during the reign of Ramses II. First, they say it didn't happen, but then they have to erroneously date the erroneous thing that didn't really happen to the time of Ramses. But if you go with the date for the Exodus proposed by the Bible itself, which we've talked about a few times on this show, which was the topic of the books I've written, 480 years prior to the construction of the Temple of Solomon, that's 1 Kings 6:1, we've talked about this before, then you get a date of around 1500 to 1445 BCE, in that range of time. And based on archaeology and textual analysis, Professors John Bimson and the late David Livingston proposed a similar date. So let's go with the biblical chronology and see if it leads us to any archaeology connected to the Israelite patriarch Joseph of the multicolored coat fame. Now, we've been going through this for a few days. This is kind of a recap, some of this, but this is a little different angle we're coming in on. And this, I think, will establish the importance and also the veracity of him being a real person. According to the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, the Israelites' stay in Egypt was 430 years. You're going to see that in Exodus 12:40. Now, according to the Talmud, the ancient rabbinic texts, it was only 215 years. And Perkei Rabbi Eliezer, around 48. Based on the lifespans of the Israelite generations that came into and left Egypt, the 215 years makes a lot more sense. But another way to look at it is that there were 2 groups that left Egypt during the biblical Exodus. One after being in Egypt for 430 years, and the other after being there for 250 years. Is it 215 years? I'm sorry. So do history and archaeology argue for or against the idea that there were 2 groups that left Egypt during the biblical Exodus? Unquestionably, they argue for it. Around the year 1500 BCE, a Canaanite group that scholars called Hyksos and that the ancient Egyptians called Amo left Egypt in a mass exodus. Scholars called this the Hyksos expulsion. At around the same time, the Bible tells us in the Hebrew original that the Amo Israel, i.e. the Israelites, followed Moses to the promised land. So, a key tisa in the Torah, we have the story of Am that created the golden calf. These seem to be the so-called Hyksos. Theirs was a direct challenge to the Moses leadership and to his Israelite kin. This was in Exodus 30. And the Hyksos counter-revolution was only put down after some 3,000 rebels were killed by Moses and his Levite family militia. That's in Exodus 32. And in any event, the biblical story clearly implies that there were 2 groups that left Egypt, the pro and the anti-Moses camps. And this is an important point because the evidence for biblical Exodus might be hiding behind Hyksos archaeology. Now, I don't think the Exodus was the Hyksos expulsion under Amos I, which we talked about. But I believe it happened around the same time, not long afterwards. And if it was Amos I who ousted the Hyksos, then was the Pharaoh who did not recognize Joseph, as the Bible tells us, didn't have any regard for him, and slapped the Hebrews into servitude. It was Moses, who was born not long after, under his granddaughter's reign, Hatshepsut. And so, not very much time in there. So when the Torah records that the original Israelites traveled to the Egyptian delta because of a famine, it seems that there was a Canaanite-ish population that was already there, the Hyksos. And in Genesis 41, verse 44, Jacob's son, Joseph, becomes Pharaoh-like. the second in command in Egypt, the second in command to the Egyptian pharaoh. And if the Talmudic estimate of the Israelite presence in Egypt is correct, Joseph's rise to power took place right around 1700 BCE. And if Joseph was indeed a pharaoh-like figure who ruled both Israelites and Hyksos, one would think that there would be some kind of a historical relic attesting to his reign. And you know what? There is. Professor Manfred Bitak, we've mentioned him before over the last week. He's been digging at Tel El Daba in Egypt for over 40 years, and he identified it as Avaris, the ancient Hyksos capital. Avaris is smack dab in the middle of the area the Bible calls Goshen, and the area that the Israelites lived in prior to the Exodus. And the word Avaris means nothing in Egyptian, but in the Torah, Joseph is repeatedly called a Hebrew. Ivri in the Hebrew language, Ivri. He's also repeatedly, curiously called Ha'ish, the man. And in other words, the word Avaris may well be related to Joseph the Ivri, the Ishivri, or the Hebrew man. And you can almost see it in the English, Avaris and the Ishivri, and the Ha'ish. And this is the Hebrew man. And all this is lost in translation when Joseph is simply called a Hebrew. And so put differently, the so-called Hyksos capital seems to be named after Joseph. Ish Ivri, Avar Ish is the name. So the name Avarish, Ish Ivri, becomes Avarish. This is named after Joseph. So between 1986 and 1988, Professor Bitak found the remains of a monumental statue that seems to have belonged to a non-Egyptian ruler of Avaris. Although only fragments remain, the archaeologists estimate the original size of the seated figure to be 2 meters in height, which is roughly 7 feet, 6 feet, something like that. And 2 meters high and 1.5 meters in depth, about 1.5 times life size. Now, over the statue's right shoulder, you can still see what they called his throw stick. It appears on the statue. And we looked at a picture of that, and here I got a picture of that. The head of the Joseph statue here. If you look at this, and just to the left of the center at bottom, you see that raised piece going up to the shoulder. That's the top of the throw stick. And that would be this image here. Right smack in the middle, you see Joseph's fist. And out the bottom is the bottom of the throw stick, and the throw stick extends along the top and curves over his shoulder a bit. It's almost like a boomerang type of a weapon. This was a scepter of office when you weren't a royal. And I want to show you one other picture here, by the way. This is a cutaway. Here. This is the tomb. Remember the little pyramidal tomb in the outer court of the palace at Avaris? This shows a piece of that on the left. That's the pyramid. But there was a little court entryway at the beginning. If you look at, let's see, where would it be? This right here. If you look at this, there, you can see the pyramidal-shaped tomb with the outer chamber and the doorway. Now, this is what you see when you walk in that outer chamber. This was the statue as it was found, only it was smashed to bits. And this is how that statue would have, in situ, this is how it would have been found in its original state. All right? So let's look at that for a minute. Just take a look at that image if you can see the imagery. And so he's got the throw stick over his right shoulder. On the back, remarkably, as with the biblical Joseph, you can still see the evidence that this ruler, whoever he is, was wearing a striped garment. It was made up of at least 3 colors, black, red, and white. And the statue was found in this tomb. This tomb was empty. This may be as a result of looting, but one can't help but recall that the biblical narrative explicitly tells us that when the Israelites left on the Exodus under Moses, they took Joseph's bones with them. That's in Exodus chapter 13 and verse 19. In other words, in order to fit with the biblical narrative, any tomb of Joseph in Egypt would have to be empty. So they call the statue the Asiatic. In other words, he's not an Egyptian. Rather, he's a man who comes from the area of Canaan and Israel. And that's, once again, that's this statue right here. The reconstructed statue. And that's the actual head you see to the right in the picture here. You see the face is gone. It's been chiseled off. There's chisel marks in the forehead here. So reconstructing the face would have to just go, they'd mathematically reconstruct this face based on what other statues of this type and style would have looked like. And so not much is left of the face, because after his rule, as with the biblical Joseph, his people seem to have experienced a downfall. To put it differently, someone in ancient times took a hammer to his face, but his hairdo is still intact. They called it the mushroom hairdo. It's specifically related to non-Egyptians from the area of ancient Canaan or Israel. And interestingly, it's quite the do. And the Talmud goes out of its way to tell us that Joseph was quite the fashionista. In Genesis Rabbah 87:3 in the Talmud. In fact, the rabbinic midrash Tanuma Vayeshib 8 specifically talks about Joseph curling his hair. Now, if you look at this statue and you look at the imagery on there, he would have curled his hair under at the ends. It's almost like some kind of a 60s or 70s women's hairstyle nowadays, going back to the 60s or 70s. And so he would have cut and trimmed and curled his hair under. Like we say, the Midrash and the rabbinic writings in the Talmud say that Joseph was quite the fashionista. Now, the statue was found in a layer that corresponded to the year 1700 BCE. In other words, if we take 1500, let's go down to my date, 1446 to 1445 BCE is the date for the Exodus. And if the Israelites' sojourn in Egypt was around 200 to 215 years long, the statue of this ruler fits perfectly the biblical story of Joseph, who ruled around 15 years prior to the Exodus, and was raised to great power by a Hyksos king. Now, of course, it's all conjecture. And we know that. It's like my entire book, my writings on Moses, are conjecture, based on archaeological evidence that isn't direct evidence. It's what I would call indirect evidence or secondary archaeological evidence. In that, when we write about Moses and we write about any of these people, we don't have anything directly saying, yes, Moses was the guy, and that was his name, and he was really Senenmut. We don't hear that. You don't find that anywhere. And like I've said before, rather tongue-in-cheek, you're not going to find a pharaoh who wrote on the walls of his mortuary temple or the walls of any of his temples listing his conquests that, and yes, my Canaanite or Asiatic slaves rose up, kicked my ass, and destroyed Egypt in the process, and I lost all of my army in the Red Sea. You're not going to see that. So the direct evidence doesn't exist. You have to go with the indirect evidence, the secondary evidence. All the things that start establishing, if you look at some of the great detective stories out there, it's a great detective mystery because the direct evidence isn't there. They have to dig and put together and build the case. And it's usually something way out here that comes in and makes the case work, and the mystery becomes solved. And I think that's what you have with Joseph. That's what you have with Moses, with the Exodus. So of course it's conjecture. But based on the evidence, I think we can say that Joseph's statue may very well have been found in Egypt. And when I look up, I've talked to my former professor, Dr. Ailing. He's been in some documentaries that mention this, where he says, and he told me directly, he says, I actually think that there's a very good case being made for the statue of Joseph. And this is Dr. Charles Ailing. He was the man who first got me interested in Amenhotep II, the pharaoh of the Exodus, and Tutmosis III, and all of these people. He's the one, when I was 11 years old, put me on to this story because I was doing a report for Sunday school. And somebody said, you ought to go talk to Dr. Chuck. Well, he wasn't a doctor at the time. He was working on his doctorate. You ought to go talk to Chucky Ailing because he's an archaeologist and he's in seminary. And so when I talked to him and I met with him, and I've told this story before, he was a little bald, horn-rimmed glasses. We're talking 1972 was when I first met him. I was 11. He was probably late 30s, early 40s. I'm trying to think of how old he is now. But he's got to have 20 years on me, and at least. So he's probably in his late 70s. But Dr. Ailing is, he went on to become, Dr. Ailing, and he was the president of the seminary I attended. He's the one who recruited me to go to seminary there. He went on to be the chair of history at Northwestern University, and he also, for 25 plus years, then he retired from that, and he became the president of the Near Middle East Biblical Archaeology Society. And I think they've dropped the biblical from the name, the Near Middle East Archeological Society. And that's the last I talked to him, just a handful of years ago when I was writing my books. And I don't know if he's retired now, and totally out of the game, but when I talked to him, he said, I believe this has got to be the statue of Joseph. And so, because historians hide, or consciously or unconsciously hide, the Israelite Jewish history behind terms like Hyksos, Asiatics, the Amo. Interestingly, the Egyptian authorities seem to believe that the statue is indeed related to the Hebrew Bible. Some years back, Professor Bitak, his find was being filmed and there were documentaries being made. And the Egyptian authorities didn't like archaeology that confirmed the Hebrew Bible. So they were told that the statue's been misplaced and nobody could find it to film it. And since the artifact weighs a whole lot, this isn't something that you can easily misplace. So it seems the Egyptians also believe that what they're hiding in the bowels of the Cairo Museum is the only monument of Joseph ever found. And why would they want to hide this? Why would the Egyptians want to hide this? Because of the political unrest between Egypt and Israel over the last 7 decades. They did not want to give Israel, the state of Israel, any animus to be able to claim that Avaris was theirs. And so it all seems so nonsensical when you bring politics and governments into it. But the archaeologists all agree this is probably who this guy is. And there are other sites related with biblical things. Now, I've always stated that I believed Sarabet el-Khadim is the holy mountain of God. Now, it's possible that it was one of the stopovers during the Exodus, this mountain out in the Sinai. But they talk about the possibility of another mountain, not St. Catherine's, the traditional site, but over across the Gulf of Aqaba. Just on the other side of Aqaba from the Sinai Peninsula is a mountain that has all the earmarks. It's got the calf drawings, the Paleo-Hebrew on the walls. It's got a lot of the earmarks, the big split rock where Moses struck the rock and it split, and there was a gushing forth of a not a stream, a spring. It's got the mountain there, which it looks like the top has been burned. All these different little earmarks, you got to look that up. I'll do something on that. I'll show you that. But the Saudi Arabian government owns that site, and they won't let anybody in there. They've got barbed wire fences all up around it, and no reason why you can't go in and look at it. They don't let archaeologists in there. There's a lot of Muslim-believing religions, Muslim governments like Egypt, like Saudi Arabia, that just don't want Israel strengthened by proving the events and the personages of the Bible. So sometimes these things disappear. So the Egyptians, I think they believe they have the statue of Joseph, or they wouldn't be hiding it in the bowels of the Cairo Museum. Now, just a little bit more about this statue, and we'll be done with Joseph. So, by the way, all of this to say, Joseph existed. He was a real guy. And I think when you look at this statue, that you are actually looking at Joseph. This is the man whom Avaris was actually named after him. It's his city. It's where he built his palace as the Grand Vizier, the second in command of Egypt. It's surrounded by the land that he and the Pharaoh gave his brothers and his family to live. All the earmarks say this was a real guy who lived in real time, in real history. So this is what I think you have with Joseph. And it was in the robber's pit that was sunk into the chapel of the Tomb 1. This tomb, this pyramidal tomb, excavators found all these fragments of this colossal statue, and dating back to 1700 BCE. Over the statue's right shoulder, you can see the throw stick, the symbol of his rule. Carved out of limestone, the colossal statue depicts an Asiatic dignitary with the mushroom-shaped coiffure and holding the throw stick. The size of the seated figure in this statue is estimated to be 2 meters high, 1.5 meters in depth, and 1.5 times the size of life. And on the back, remarkably, you can see the evidence of the paint colors and the striping. The skin was yellow, the traditional color of Asiatics in Egyptian art. As you can see, if we take one quick last look at these Asiatics, this image right here, see the Egyptians on the upper right, very dark brownish tan, reddish brown tan skin. You see the Asiatics were done in a yellowish color. So, this is what you have on the statue. It was a seated statue. Life size, nearly twice the life of size. It's excellent quality. And Tel El Dab, and other parts of the kingdom like Serabit El Khadim, this mountain I talked to you about, where I've been twice in the Sinai, the presence of high Asiatic functionaries who were obviously in service to the Egyptian crown is very evident. And the form of the statue has no parallels in Egypt. And a similar figure is known from the palace of Ebia, dating approximately to the same period, the 18th century BCE, but it was made in a much cruder fashion. And according to B-Tech's description, the statue was found in a fragmentary form within a robber's pit inside the funerary chapel preceding the small pyramidal burial tomb. And the statue was smashed intentionally, suggesting that there was a political turmoil in the region. And it's unclear whether this tomb belonged to the Middle Salahas, which could be considered a predecessor of the palace of the early 13th dynasty in the stratums above, or whether it belonged to this palace from its position in relation to the Middle Lasahas and the other tombs that were considered probable that belonged to the late 12th dynasty. So you've got all this information. No exact proof saying this is Joseph scrawled on the statue, but I believe we have seen the face of Joseph, or at least the image of Joseph, and that he was a man that existed, and he fits into history. No matter what you think of the theology of the Bible, the history of the Bible is intact. And Joseph, no matter how the story may have been used or changed or manipulated, actually existed in Egypt and in history. And that's all we got for tonight, folks. We got to go. We will see you in 23 hours after this break. We'll be right back. Sit tight.